In this video, I'll be discussing some sock fit tips. If you're a subscriber, welcome back. If you're new to my channel, welcome. I'm happy to have you here. So there's a few tips that are good for perfecting the fit of your hand knit socks, and I'll discuss a few of them in this video. The first one is to knit a gauge swatch. Now, with the caveat that a lot of times knitters don't want to knit a gauge swatch for their socks, and I can totally understand that, and I often do not knit a gauge swatch for my socks because by the time you work a gauge swatch that is large enough to measure properly, you are already halfway through knitting a sock. So what you can do instead, if you are unsure of what your gauge is going to be with a particular yarn and a particular pattern, is to work the beginning of the sock, and so this works best if it's cuff down. So work the cuff and a little bit of the leg, and then put the sock on waste yarn and try it on and see if it's going to fit. Is it going to fit on the leg? Is it going to fit across the widest spot that it needs to get over, which is the heel diameter? And is it going to fit on the ball of the foot? And then make adjustments if you need to, if it's too tight or too loose. This isn't ideal because then you need to rip out your knitting, but at least you haven't knit your whole sock before finding out that it's not going to fit. Your best bet is to work a gauge swatch with a particular yarn and in the pattern that you're using. But again, this is going to use a good bit of yarn and a good bit of knitting time that you could just be spending knitting the sock. So start the sock and know that you may need to rip out and start again with an adjustment if it doesn't fit. Make sure that your gauge is nice and tight though, so don't change needle size drastically and start to produce a floppy, loose, open gauge. Your socks will not wear well. They will wear out faster at a looser gauge. So keep your tension, the actual gauge in mind, and be working a nice tight gauge to produce the fabric that will be hard wearing for socks. So you may need to change stitch count if the sample sock that you've started knitting as your gauge swatch doesn't fit and is too tight or too loose. You may need to actually change stitch count. Once you have your gauge figured out, next is picking a size of diameter of sock to work. Socks fit best when there is some negative ease. So you want about 10% of negative ease in the leg, in the ankle, and in the ball of the foot. So whatever finished sock circumference you are working towards, it should be about 10% smaller than your actual foot measurements. Socks will stretch as they go on, and this stretching, having it be a smaller diameter than the leg, will help the sock cuff stay up on the leg and be comfortable. You also want a little bit of negative ease in the length of the sock, in the foot area as well. Not quite 10%, maybe like 5% negative ease in the length of the sock. Then this way the sock will also stretch lengthwise a little bit and be snug on the foot. So 10% smaller in the circumference is about 1 inch for an adult sock and about 1/2 inch for a child sock. Another tip for getting socks to fit well is to use a really stretchy cuff treatment. 1x1 rib is the stretchiest ribbing that you can produce, so it works really well at the top cuff, top of the leg, in socks to help hold the sock up against the leg. Going along with that, make sure that your cast on, if you're working cuff down, or your bind off, if you're working toe up, at the cuff is stretchy. You want it to be stretchy enough to go on over this diagonal, the heel diagonal, which is the largest circumference on your foot. And so that cast on or bind off edge there needs to stretch enough to accommodate that diameter. With 1x1 ribbing, I like to use a tubular cast on or bind off, worked at an appropriate tension so that it maintains the stretch of that 1x1 rib. A bind off that works really well if you don't want to use tubular is Jenny's Surprisingly Stretchy Bind Off. That works really well with 1x1 ribbing and looks nice and is very stretchy. Next, I'll talk about some fit modifications that you may have to make to patterns. So the majority of sock patterns are written assuming that the circumference at the ball of your foot and the circumference at your ankle are the same measures. And this holds true for the average foot, but not everyone fits in those average foot boxes. Everyone has different foot anatomy. So you'll want to measure your foot or your recipient's foot and know these measures. The key measures are the ball of your foot, the circumference, the ankle and the circumference, in addition to the length from the back of the heel to the tip of the toe, and a preferred cuff height on the leg from either from the floor or from the top of the heel to the desired cuff height. If your circumference at the ball of the foot and your ankle are two different measures, then you will need to modify your sock pattern and work towards the desired circumference at the ankle, and then work your heel, and then after the heel, work towards that different stitch count for the circumference of the ball of your foot. This is fairly easily done because usually, even with other heel treatments, this is a heel flap and heel turn with a gusset, but typically, the bottom of the foot is worked in plain stockinette, so it's more comfortable on the bottom of the foot when you're wearing it. So in that area, it's really easy to change a stitch count without affecting the stitch pattern at the top of the foot. So you can add or remove stitches in this area after the heel in order to get to your desired stitch count at the ball of the foot. Now, if you have wide toes, then you may want to pick a toe treatment that will fit better with your toe anatomy. There are lots of different toes out there. I have a video showing a whole bunch of different toes. I will link to it. So choose a toe treatment that fits your toe anatomy best. You could even try working an anatomical toe treatment if you find that your big toe produces a very strong asymmetric look to your toes. Then try working an anatomical toe treatment, but keep in mind you will then have a definite right and left sock that you will need to wear, and so just keep that in mind with those, but those are possible. If you have a wide or a narrow heel, you can change your heel treatment to fit your heel shape better as well. So a heel flap heel is fairly easy to change. You change the heel turn to make it narrower or wider or more boxy. If you use a square heel, it will be a more boxy shape. A half handkerchief is more of a triangular wedge shape from the back of the heel to the front of the heel. So you can change your heel treatment as well to fit the shape of your heel. There are also a lot of different heel treatments, and I have a video showing a whole bunch of different heel treatments. I will also link that above. Speaking of heels, if you know your heel diameter, which is the measure from the tip of the back of your heel to the spot where your ankle meets your instep, that diameter is the largest measure on our foot. If you have a really large heel diameter, then short row heels will tend to be too tight across this area of your foot and be uncomfortable while you are wearing, because short row heels do not add any extra stitches in this area. A heel flap and turn and gusset shape adds more fabric in this area and therefore can be more comfortable for people that have a large heel diameter measure. It can be hard to predict if a short row heel is going to be too snug for you. This heel diameter measure is difficult to nail down what an average measure that is, and so give short row heels a try, and if you find that they are too snug, then that means that your diameter is a little bit larger, and you will need to make accommodations if you want to use short row heels. One way to make short row heels fit better with wider heel diameters is to add gussets to the short rows before you work the short row heel and then remove them after. That adds more stitches, more space in this fabric area, and provides more room for that diameter to make those a little more comfortable. If you have a high arch, so this area of your foot rises higher, give a double gusset at the bottom of the heel a try, because that curves this fabric up at the bottom of the heel and can perhaps fit a high arch a little bit better on the foot. It can be really helpful to know your row gauge when knitting socks, since you need to know when to stop before you start your toe. Or if you're working toe up, you need to know when to stop before you start your heel. And 9 times out of 10, knitters will not match the designer's row gauge. Even if you can match the stitch gauge, your row gauge will likely be different. And this is just a function of knitting. It's really difficult to match stitch gauge and row gauge. So you need to know your row gauge so that you can determine when you need to stop before working the toe. This will involve a little bit of math, because you'll need to know how many rows are in the toe and calculate based on your gauge how long the toe will end up being, which will tell you then when to stop knitting before you start your toe based on your row gauge. Same as can be held true for a heel. Figure out, do the math to figure out how many rows are in the heel of your toe up heel, to then calculate based on your row gauge how long that heel is, so that you know when to stop before you start your heel. So knowing your row gauge can help you produce a better fitting sock. One way to help ensure that your sock fits well and takes into account variations of gauge and whatnot is to use a ribbing pattern in the sock as a whole. Like this example, it used 1x1 ribbing at the cuff, and then a 2x2 ribbing through the leg and then the top of the foot. And this with ribbing in the leg and in half of the foot, it helps to provide some more stretch so that it can accommodate a bit of a variation in circumference in the leg and the foot. So that can be helpful as well. If you are concerned about fit, use a ribbing throughout the whole entire sock, and that will help snug that fabric up and make them fit even better. So those are just a few tips for getting your hand knit socks to fit a little bit better. Do you have some tips to share? Put them in the comments below. I hope this was helpful. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and thank you so much for watching.